I'm Sarah Rose, Vice President of Education and Programs at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It is my pleasure to introduce Fred Toomey, President of the Port Society.
Thank you very much, and we're happy to be here. Thank you. Morning, Fred. Morning. We're happy to be hosting you here. This is our first major event. Hopefully we'll be having many more of this nature in here. I'll be talking to you later on this afternoon about the progress and about what we have accomplished here over the past 2 years of our building project. So without delaying it, I'll let Peggy get going. I know you want to listen to her. And I will be back sometime later on this afternoon to give you a review of, hopefully you won't be too tired or too bored by then, to give you a review of all the construction and what happened and how we spent $2.9 million. So thank you very much, and enjoy your day.
Fred's taking some really nice vacations. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you need to use the restrooms, the most convenient one is if you just go back down the stairs here, and that little hallway before you get to the salt box, there's a men's and ladies' room right there, very conveniently located. We have arranged with Destination Soups to deliver box lunches. Hopefully you heard about this at the front desk, but if you're interested in a box lunch, you need to let me know now because we're going to just place the order. The lunches will be available back at the museum in the Jacobs Family Gallery after Arthur's lecture, and you can just pick them up there. So if anyone didn't order a lunch but would like to have one ordered for them, we'd happily do that. You'd like one? 2. And I think the choices are turkey, veg, or roast beef. Turkey. Veg, okay. And it's $10 and you can just settle up. So, I'm sorry, 2 veggies and a turkey, is that what I just heard? Okay. Terrific. All right, and then without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. I feel like Peggy needs no introduction. Peggi Medeiros, author, historian, just such a wealth of knowledge about New Bedford, and we're just delighted to have her here today to kick off this Mariners Home Symposium. When we originally scheduled this symposium, it was supposed to be after the opening because the governor was going to come in April. And now the opening is actually officially May 19th at 10 o'clock right back here in the Mariners Home. Peggy has a wealth of knowledge about the city of New Bedford, and we're just delighted to have her here this morning to tell us about William Rotch Jr. Thank you, Peggy.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. William Rotch Jr.'s name tells us a lot. He was born a junior, and he remains one to history. His grandfather, Joseph, and his father, William Sr., were the really famous Roaches, at least in William Jr.'s lifetime. They established one of the first worldwide, multinational, family-owned whaling trades, and it extended through generations. We had Roach whaling ships operating across the globe. The oiled bone and spermaceti they brought back were processed in Roach family candleworks and oil factories. Their basic allegiance was to the family and ensuring the family fortune. And for taking that approach, I have to thank historian Sarah Crabtree, who is an authority on Quaker history and on William Rotch Sr. And she is presently working on a book on William Rotch Sr. And she started me thinking about what it meant to be a member of the Society of Friends and to run a business. And there is the old pirate, William Rotch Sr. On Nantucket, Joseph Rotch and William Sr. set up what became the Rotch family empire. The Nantucket Roaches, beginning with Joseph and continuing on, did business with Aaron Lopez of Newport. He's an absolutely fascinating Portuguese Jew who established his own massive firm, and he whaled, processed oil and bone, and traded slaves. The Roaches, through what became another branch of the family, the Rodman family, Samuel Rodman Sr., they went into business with Lopez, and together they established a monopoly on producing spermaceti candles. This is before the Revolution. It was such a strong monopoly that John Hancock couldn't break it, and he tried. During the Revolution, Nantucket attempted to stay neutral. William Rotch Sr. attempted to continue whaling with Aaron Lopez, and they sent ships to the Falkland Islands. A great number of them were captured by the British. I think perhaps one or two of a tiny fleet got through. William established diplomatic relations for the island with both the British and the Continental Congress. And this brought him dislike, suspicion, and 2 trials for treason from the American side. In fact, later in his life, I discovered a wonderful correspondence with John Adams, where the two, by that point, elderly men are going back and forth, and William Rotch Sr. was still furious at having been accused of treason. So at the same time during the Revolution, you cannot say this family did not think ahead. Joseph Roach came to New Bedford. He made, at that point, in 1764, the 10-acre purchase, which is actually all of this around us. He did it to set up a family base away from Nantucket. 1 year later, he bought a large parcel of land in what was then Fairhaven Village, and that land remained in the Roach family for 65 years. And there are Fairhaven historians who still complain about the fact that the roaches impeded the growth of Fairhaven. Joseph Roach built a house just down the street. The British burned the house to the ground in 1789. After the Revolution, as many of us know, American oil was not accepted in British ports. And this meant there was a major problem, obviously, for American whalers. There were a couple of solutions that were tried. A number of Nantucket families went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and began whaling there. William thought about it, decided he didn't want to do that. So he went first to Great Britain and attempted to make a deal that would allow him to whale with Roach ships out of Britain. It didn't work, and he tried something else and ended up being in the second revolution of his life. We'll get to him in a moment. He went to France and established a whaling station in Calais and managed to make it through the French Revolution. At the same time, however, William Rotch Jr. and his brother-in-law and best friend, Samuel Rodman Sr., ran the business at home. They ran it initially from Nantucket, and there is wonderful correspondence from William Rotch Sr. to William Jr. and to Samuel and to his other children back on Nantucket. By 1791, the Roaches had left Nantucket. There was a huge amount of ill feeling on Nantucket about the Roaches, and if you read Nantucket histories, it gives you a sense of it. They were furious at William Sr. for his actions during the Revolution. They were even more angry at him for taking Nantucket whalers first to France and then to Wales. His son Benjamin had married a Nantucket girl, promising he would not take her off island, and he did, and he took her to France, and it turned out that she became so seasick that she never saw Nantucket again. So we have, by 1791, we have the Roaches here, and it became the whaling center of the world. William Rotch Jr. was 28 years old when he left Nantucket and came to New Bedford. In 1782, he'd married Elizabeth Rodman, the sister of his closest friend. In a very neat exchange, Samuel Rodman married Elizabeth Roach, William's older sister. His brother Thomas married Charity Rodman, And those initial Roach-Rodman marriages created a dynasty of hyphenated children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And affection provided very, very good for business. The only one of the Roach children who did not go into the whaling business was Thomas Rodman, who had married Thomas Roach, who had married Charity, took her out to Ohio, where they founded Kendall, Ohio, and there are absolutely wonderful letters from William Sr. to Thomas that you can see in John Morgan Bullard's The Roaches. But there is also a wonderful online site in Massillon, Ohio, which contains all of the letters that were written to Thomas and Charity from their families. And you can not only find William Rotch Jr.'s handwriting, thank goodness they give you a text translation. So William Rotch Jr. immediately decided to build a house. That's one portrait, which is attributed to Peel, and I think that's absolutely true. This is William Rotch Jr. as an older man. And that is a very, very early daguerreotype that I found of him. And this is Elizabeth Rodman Roach, his wife. And oddly enough, it's very difficult to find out a lot about her. The Roach women, who I think in many ways are far more interesting than the men, you have to go hunting sideways for them. I imagine she was known to be extremely beautiful. Obviously, this is Elizabeth in old age. Samuel Rodman Sr., William's best friend, Rembrandt Peale, and the families were extremely close. This is Aaron Lopez. That is absolutely the best image of him I could find. And right now, a lot more research is being done on Aaron Lopez and his son-in-law, Jacob Riveras. And they were out of Newport. Okay, we don't have any early photographs of the Mariners' Home, but I did find this version of the Samuel Rodman Jr. mansion. It was on the corner right now of William and North Water. There's an antiques place there. The Mariners' Home is actually directly across the street. That actually was a typo. It was 1895. So William built a classic federal home on North Water Street, on the exact spot where Joseph Roach's had stood. In 1791, William was writing to his Uncle Francis in England about the house. I have also a house covered and now finishing upon the spot my grandfather stood, 15 feet back from the street, 46 feet front, 40 feet back, that in a few years I hope the desolation occasioned by the fire will no more be traced. The town grows very fast, but being entirely dependent upon the spermaceti fishery, it is precarious. But I hope it will always find a support. We have 3 promising children, Sarah, 4.5 years old, William, 2, and Joseph the infant. So very young children grew up in the what we now call the Mariners' Home. By 1790, he was writing to someone who was carrying out his commissions. I shall want a platform and steps, also 2 sets jambs, assuming that's door jambs, mantelpieces and hearths, which request thou would have made in the best way. I will either send thee candles or cash. My candles are of the best quality and of being the best kind for the West India market. Roach knew exactly what he wanted. He was a very determined man. I would not have wanted to work for him. He wanted the steps to descend in front and on each end and connected all around those three sides. And of course, we can still find those steps and that platform. Inside, he specified exact dimensions and style. Let's see. That is one of the earliest views I was able to find. And you'll notice there's a balustrade on the roof of the mariner's home. He talked about the mantelpieces, which he wanted 40 inches long, and he wanted the framing around them to flare, so as to agree with the front of 40 inches and the back 28 inches. And then he complained about prices. The prices thou sent me of the foregoing articles are higher than I expected, or than I was informed of from Nantucket. By May 14th, he was writing to Joseph Eddy to find him the detail that was going to mark the house as his. I herewith send thee a mold for a chimney back, and request thou would have me cast 2 backs, as soon as may be. If thou hast a neat Roman alphabet, I shall like to have this motto put on them in a neat manner in one line: Nobilitas est enca virtuis. But if it cannot be done well, I'd rather it was omitted. He specified that the marble was to be imported from Pennsylvania and to arrive properly polished to be placed in. He asked for either white or chocolate marble and ring-handled closet fasteners. Finally, in November 1791, he sent shipbuilder Zachariah Hillman to North Carolina for ship timber and a few last items for the house. Also, garden posts of cedar and joists for sills and rails of my walk. Also, cedar timber for window frames. Should any accident happen to thee, send for beetle if gushing is not sufficient. If more help is wanting, thou must hire it. And reading these letters and looking at this, I've become more and more fascinated with the fact that whaling and trade went on along, and the Roaches and Rodmans were involved, the entire Atlantic seacoast, all the way down to the West Indies. Well, the finished house was an elegant compromise with Quaker doctrine. It stated that homes built by members of the society should not be ostentatious or display wealth too openly. That ruling was further enforced by a tax on brick houses. And that's probably from the 1950s. Well, interestingly enough, William Rotch Jr. got round this. He got round the tax and the doctrine. The front facade of the house is clapboard, and he used brick on the 3 other facades, so he wouldn't have to pay taxes. Later, in 1834, he did exactly the same thing when he moved up the hill to County Street. The Roach Jones Duff House is clapboarded completely, but underneath that is brick. We know the house was painted a straw color, and it's that again. There were 4 rooms on the ground floor. There were window seats in the formal parlor, and very fine paneling that was still intact. There was a central entrance with formal stairs and a beautiful federal balustrade at the roof line. If you want to get a sense of a balustrade on a federal house, look at the Andrew Robeson House, where its owners did replace that balustrade. Just about all of the federal houses and buildings in New Bedford should have and did have balustrades on the roof line, including the Whaling Museum Sundial building. This was the first of the great Roach houses. It was large enough not only for a growing family, because Sarah, William, and Joseph were joined in 1792 by Thomas, and then in 1793 by Mary, and all grew up in this house. And I think it's quite wonderful that children did grow up in what's today the Mariners' home. Ship by ship and candle by candle and building lot by lot, the Rotch family and the Rodmans grew very rich. In 1795, William's parents formally located in New Bedford, and they became a sort of unquakerly royalty. In 1796, the Duc de la Rochefoucauld brought his carriage to William Rotch Sr.'s door in what we call the Mansion House on Union Street. By 1818, the entire family was noticeably grand. We have a couple of wonderful first-hand accounts of the family. Anna Shoemaker, who became Hathaway, visited New Bedford to meet the family she was about to marry into. And she wrote about the view of the Rotch family. "We had a dinner not better, my dearest Richard, than many I've eaten at thy hospitable board, not any better served or cooked, and I began to think there's something in having a name as well as being wealthy. For everyone here looks up to them as if they were the princes of the land." We have an even better view from William Logan Fisher. He was quite young. He was sent from Philadelphia because there was an enormous back and forth between Philadelphia and New Bedford, and families like the Morgans ended up here. He was sent to be an apprentice with William Rotch Jr., and as an apprentice, he was expected to live in the household. While he was here, he fell in love with and eventually married Mary Rodman. And years later, he described this courtship, and he wrote a memoir. "I was an extremely dull and stupid scholar, and the end of it all was that I learned little, and that little was soon forgotten." So he was sent off to New Bedford. He was a quasi-member of the family. He was expected to work. He was expected to learn every corner of what was then Bedford Village. Later, he wrote about imported silver teapots and carpets, which of course the Roaches were among the first in New Bedford to have. He made friends, but there was always that line. "Such was the custom of the times that I never knew what would now be called a tea party, nor was I ever invited to drink tea, even in a friendly way, with these young people with whom almost as a matter of course I was expected to spend the evening." He was invited to dinner along with members of the Rotch family, but he never received his own invitation. And he kind of sadly notes, "Yet I was on the most intimate footing with all the Rotch and Rodman families." Well, Mary Rodman arrived from boarding school, and William Logan Fisher fell in love with her. This was 1796. They read books together. He read and talks about how he made up for what he hadn't learned at school in Philadelphia. The young people were kept on very short leases. "My master, William Rotch, wishes to have his home shut up at 10 o'clock, and I do not think I was ever out a quarter of an hour after that time." There's a partially happy ending because in 1802, Fisher and Mary Rodman married. He became a man of business. He talks about the fact about New Bedford taking gardens very seriously. And he notes, "I had one of the nicest gardens in that place, stocked with shrubbery, fruits, and flowers." Unfortunately, somehow he had developed a case of mercury poison, and he couldn't use one arm. So the family moved from New Bedford back to Philadelphia, and Mary Logan Fisher died in 1813. William Logan Fisher, however, never forgot New Bedford, and over the years he wrote a series of sketches that were published in the Morning Mercury. So we get a sense of what it was like for him in New Bedford. Okay, I have only been able to find 2 interior photographs of the Mariners' home. Both were taken in 1962 Both are in the Library of Congress. Both are copyright free. In 1962, the federal government was just beginning work in historic preservation, and they sent teams of historians and photographers to historic places across the country, and they chose New Bedford. So we have this view of an absolutely beautiful staircase. And that's, go back a bit. Well, one is missing. There's a second floor shot that is quite wonderful. Meanwhile, I've always wondered what on earth William Rotch Jr. was like. I mean, he was enormously wealthy. He was considered the first man in New Bedford. Of all people, Daniel Ricketson, the historian and later friend of Thoreau, leaves a wonderful description of William Rotch Jr. William Rotch Jr., as he always wrote his name, was a man of marked ability and dignity of manner. He always reminded me of the pictures of William Penn, to which his primitive dress in a good degree contributed. He was a large man, as you remember from that portrait, his height nearly 6 feet and broad and stout in person. His countenance was less benign, perhaps in expression, than his father's, and his complexion florid. But he was a man of sterling integrity and worth, kind and hospitable, and though not perhaps generous from impulse, was often so from principle. The business grew, the family expanded with family members, and then it contracted as children married, and as Sarah, his daughter, married and the sons left. The waterfront, by the 1830s, was less and less a place to live. It smelled, to be honest. There were candle works, there was spermaceti oil, there were lots of marine supply shops, and harpoons were being hammered out. You had barrel makers rolling casks up and down the streets. It was a place for cold, hard business. Most of the Rodman and Roach children had already moved up to County Street. Sarah Roach Arnold and her husband James Arnold built their mansion in 1821. William Jr. was still in the house. In 1828, his wife Elizabeth died, and on May 16th, his father died at 94. He was the most distinguished citizen in New Bedford. He had been taken care of in his old age on Union Street in the Mansion House by his daughter Mary and by his niece Eliza. As soon as he died, Eliza was free to marry, and she married a Harvard professor, and that's a whole other story. But William Rotch Jr. at that point was 68, and he felt he was becoming old. He found a housekeeper for the house on what was called Roach's Hill. Lydia Scott was a childless widow. She had been known to the family for years and years. Her father had been Job Scott, who was an enormously important Quaker preacher. Well, within a year, the two of them were married, not in New Bedford, but in North Providence, Rhode Island. Lydia was 46. The family was not happy. The diary entries, especially some of Samuel Rodman's, give the impression that William Jr. had married, a housemaid. At that point, he moved up to County Street and hired Richard Upjohn to design what is today the Roach Jones Duff House. He lived there until 1850. He and Lydia had spent 16 years in that house. And then Lydia disappeared completely from New Bedford. It turned out she went to Boston. She lived until the Civil War, and she died on July 18th, 1863 at 80. And trying to figure out why she was sort of written out of Roach history, I did a little bit of research. She became a disciple of Swedenborg, and she left them a small fortune, which was administered by members of the Roach family. She was blind at the end of her life, and members of the Society of the New Jerusalem, a Swedenborgian group, would come to read to her daily. And she was responsible through the Roach money for publishing one of the first complete American editions of Swedenborg's work. So what happened to the Mariners' Home between 1834 and 1850? We know what happened in 1850. William Rotch Jr. died. Sarah Arnold gave the house to the New Bedford Port Society. But something had to happen between 1834 and 1850. So I started doing some research. First I looked back in 1850 and found that it was called the Acushnet House. So I kept looking, and there's the house in snow. Okay, we will get to him in a moment. John Morgridge and his family came to town in the 1830s. In 1834, he ran the Elm Street Academy, which was a day and evening school to teach fine writing to young ladies and gentlemen. Then he branched out into medicine. The medicine at that point was absolutely dreadful. A lot of the treatments would kill you more than anything else. Bleeding was still an accepted procedure because the thought was that a number of diseases were caused by too much blood. So ironically, if you became ill, you were bled, which of course weakened you. John Morgridge was a different kind of doctor. He was interested in herbs and hot stone, and he opened practice in William Rotch Jr.'s former home. The mansion became the Thomsonian Botanic Infirmary at 45 Water Street. But quite before that happened, it was the Roach House, which opened in 1834 with a notice from Pardon Brightman. The subscriber respectfully informs his friends and the public that he is removed from his house on Elm Street to the more spacious and commodious home on Water Street, formerly occupied by William Rotch, nearly opposite the Merchants' Bank. The notice went on to say that Brightman intended to cater to the accommodation and comfort of permanent and transient boarders. He ran advertisements in Nantucket newspapers, and that was a smart thing to do since everybody knew the Roach name. By August 7th, he was soliciting guests for the Roach House, and he talks about the fact that the house is pleasantly situated in the most central part of the town. The rooms are airy and retired, and the subscriber hopes by strict attention to business to merit a share of the public patronage. Now, what caught me was there's attached to the premises a spacious barn where good stabling can be had. Well, apparently there weren't enough visitors. So then we have the switch over to John Morgridge, botanic physician and agent for Dr. Samuel Thompson. This is Dr. Samuel Thompson, who invented the Thomsonian system. And Morgridge was sort of licensed to practice Thompson's procedures. He boarded patients at the infirmary, and he treated men and women. He also would treat patients at home. At this point, medicine was, as I mentioned, as much witchcraft and alchemy as science. Morgridge was using very powerful herbs, primarily lobelia flowers, to which he added cayenne pepper. He paired this with using hot stones to sweat out fevers, and this earned him the nickname of the steam doctor. Often the treatment seemed to have worked. The problems came when it didn't, because on September 1st, 1837, Eliza Howland died under his care. Morgridge was charged with manslaughter by the administration of lobelia and other similar prescriptions, and the charge made newspapers all over the East Coast. Morgridge wasn't a fool, and he found the smartest lawyer in New Bedford. He went to John H.W. Page, a lawyer and close friend of John James Audubon. Page called a number of witnesses, including Frederick Howland, who testified that Eliza S. Howland was my wife. He said there was nothing in Dr. Morgridge's conduct that I complained of or was offended at. He called a number of witnesses. They all testified in the doctor's favor. Traditional New Bedford doctors, and there were a number of them, from Paul Spooner to Alexander Reed and William Rotch Jr. and Julius Mayhew and Lyman Bartman, they declared in print that the death of Mrs. Eliza L. Howland is attributable solely to the medicines administered to her during her sickness. Well, Morgridge was acquitted. That is the lobelia plant. He might not have been acquitted if anybody had remembered a teenager named John Robinson Jr., who died in October 1821 in Litchfield, Maine. He'd been healthy, strong, a farm boy, had a cold, then he was dead. When he took ill, the family suggested giving him Indian tobacco. He was a cousin of John Morgridge, who gave him the herb. He also gave him lobelia. He tried to sweat the fever out, and the boy died. And if anyone had known about John Robinson Jr. and his death, the Thomsonian Botanic Infirmary case might have ended differently, or perhaps not. In the 1830s, the idea of being treated with herbs was attractive, and perhaps safer than conventional doctors dispensing primarily opium cut with alcohol, which may have been very pleasant, but it was not very good. Lobelia was described as an innocent vegetable that cannot do much mischief. In any event, the Roaches were not happy with this publicity. So they quickly found another use for the house. And on April 18, 1848, it became William H. Cox's Acushnet House for the entertainment of permanent and transient company. He promises good fare and every accommodation the house affords to those who may favor him with a call. So everyone felt the Acushnet House was much safer for the family reputation and for the health of New Bedford. So after William Rotch died, of course, the Seamen's Bethel had already been built, and anyone who wants to can follow the building of the Seamen's Bethel in Samuel Rodman's diary, because Samuel was a early member of the Port Society, and he looked in every day. So you can follow the process of how the Bethel was built. There was a great concern for the welfare of whalers and other seamen. A number of them, as you may know, could not read or write. That's one reason why the Bethel had classes very early to teach downstairs, to teach people to read and write. In 1850, Sarah Arnold gave her father's home to the Mariners' Home. Is this going to work for us? Oh, this is Samuel Thompson. That's more lobelia. This is the Arnold family in Rome. We often think of James and Sarah as being quite elderly. Well, this was their European tour. James, Elizabeth, and Sarah. And since Sarah was the begetter, in effect, of the Mariners' Home, this is an earlier photograph of her. As you know, for over a century, the Mariners' Home provided clean sanctuary and food and religious and practical aid to seamen. In 2009 it closed, and now, after a multi-million-dollar restoration and this wonderful connection that we have there, William Rotch Jr.'s home is now a first-floor museum with upper-floor offices for Whale and the New Bedford Preservation Society, and of course the New Bedford Port Society that has looked after it all these years. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about your methods? I sit here and I'm just stunned at what you learned. How did you learn about these things?
Well, as my friends will tell you, since about 1978, I've spent a fortune on books about New Bedford. I was one of the few people, I think, born to use a computer, so that what you can find online now, everywhere from the Boston Public Library to the Whaling Museum, to the Smithsonian, to the New York Free Public Library, is wonderful. And I guess I'd always wanted to be a detective, so if I can find a thread, I start pulling at the threads. Recently, I wrote something for the museum on sailors' valentines, and I became fascinated with the history of Barbados, where they came from. And I started thread pulling, and I found that the Rodman family had begun in Barbados, moved to Newport, and then ended up here. But, I mean, a lot of it is just slogging through and trying everything. Yes?
Now, they moved the Mariners home.
Mm-hmm. By
literally
oxen, as we've
across
been
the
told.
street. So why would they have spent the money to move it such a short distance?
I think the reason, and I've looked back at newspaper coverage, and nobody specifically says why. What I think was that they knew the New Bedford Port Society was going to be responsible for overseeing the Mariners' home. And it just made sense. And since the money was there and oxen were ready to do it, it made sense to just move it up the hill and set it exactly where it is. And apparently the move went very, very well. And it also gave North Water Street room for expansion, which was important because land down here in this area next to the wharfs was very, very valuable.
Thank you.
Yes?
I understand what you mean about the land being valuable, but when you were talking about what the Roach House was used for from, I don't know, 1830,
Yeah, 1834.
1850, and it's, you know, some almost disreputable type things and a lodging house and that sort of thing, made me wonder, so did all the wealthy people move up to county?
As quickly as they can. When you walk the national park, you see obviously the Mariners' home, you see the Benjamin Rodman mansion, you see the Andrew Robeson mansion, which was originally across the street with wonderful gardens around it. So the Roaches and the Rodmans pretty much in the early days owned all the land down here, and they built. And then there was this general move up the hill. A lot of the land up the hill in the early 1800s was owned by the Russell family that went spectacularly bankrupt. And so a lot of the Roaches bought land up there. And it's possible, for example, Samuel Rodman moved up a little bit, Rodman Jr. moved up a little bit later, but I found a diary of his that described step by step how he built his house, which is now on the corner of Spring and County. And it's wonderful because it's a paperback pamphlet of his enormous diary that was not included in the printed version. And online I was able to find it listed.
I've done research on a later part of the Roach family, Abbot Lawrence Roach, and his brother Arthur,
Yes.
So I look to you to connect the period when they were working here and very, very hard to when they, whatever branch of the family moved to Boston to Commonwealth Avenue and just spending the money.
Well, that branch came from William J. Rotch. We know William J. Rotch. He was the second mayor of New Bedford. He was married to two Morgan girls. One died and he married her sister. He originally built what is today the William Rotch Cottage, which is a National Historic Landmark. He was the nephew of James and Sarah Arnold. They died without heirs, so he inherited the Arnold Mansion, which he turned into, and by that point, he built the cottage in 1846. By the time Arnold died, he had a lot of children, including that branch. And just about all of his children, who spent time growing up in two historic buildings, moved to Boston. Just about all the Roaches had ended up at Harvard. A number stayed there. There was a lot of toing and froing between New Bedford and Boston, especially in the winter. You have families like the Arnold family who owned a townhouse in Boston, and they would spend winters in Boston. So the move up to Boston was a very natural and quite fascinating one. The only thing that I feel sad about is that the wonderful portrait of the Arnold family, which had been done in Rome, and of course used to hang on what is now the staircase of the Wamsutta Club, was given by Abbott Lawrence and his friends to Harvard. So it technically belongs to the Arnold Arboretum, and we just have sort of black and white versions of what the painting looks like.
Well, and Abbott Lawrence Roach, there must have been intermarriage with Lawrence
Yes.
at some point, and he went on to become the first meteorology professor at Harvard and founded Blue Hill Observatory, designed by his brother Arthur Roach, who founded the MIT Architecture Department.
Who was married to a Colt heiress. And he died very young. She ended up marrying a second time and is a fascinating woman who lived most of her life in Venice. Yes?
When did Roach convert, and was he forced by the society to convert?
Well, in 1820, there was a huge religious schism in New Bedford between what were called New Light and Old Light Quakers. The Roaches and the Rodmans were right in the middle of it. It was basically about interpretations on how to respond to the inner light. And Mary Roach and her niece Eliza, who had grown up in England, were New Light Quakers. And if you're interested in the whole schism, Joseph Anthony's diary, New Bedford 100 years ago, breaks it down really well. Gradually, between 1820 and on, just about everyone left the Society of Friends. Mary Roach, for example, became the closest thing to a Unitarian and had a great deal of influence on Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller. The split was that you either joined the Unitarian Church, and you can find all kinds of first family names in the pews who owned them, or you joined Grace Episcopal Church. And, I'm sorry? The Grace Episcopal Church. And a great Samuel Rodman Jr., the wonderful writer, diarist, was a very religious man. He was probably the last member of the Roach or Rodman family to remain in the Society of Friends. And in his diary, he notes very sadly, as each of his daughters and his wife leave the society and join Grace Episcopal Church. And he was a remarkably open man who loved church hopping. So you can find descriptions of the Seamen Bethel services, First Baptist Church, Grace Episcopal Church. He would go along with his family to services and talk about how the church had been decorated with pine branches for Christmas.
With all the intermarriage, how were there not some of the traditional problems that come from, for lack of a better word, inbreeding?
Well, it's interesting. I am lucky enough to know Louis Howland, who is involved with very passionately involved with the museum and exhibitions. And he has a wonderful saying that you can trace a family. If you can get a family through 3 generations without hitting drunkards or drug addicts, you're lucky. Probably the Boston Roaches were very impressive, and so were the Rodmans. They didn't have as many, at least as far as we know, problems as some other families did who were involved in a lot of intermarriage. And the families in the generations after the Roach-Rodman marriages tended to reach further. There were the marriages in Philadelphia to the Morgan girls, and Charles W. Morgan, who of course married and moved to New Bedford. So you started to have a little bit of spread. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.